He ruined his last girlfriend's life so badly, she had to fake her own identity and vanish. Dante gave Alara one brutal warning before she agreed to stay with him permanently. He confessed that a rival gang once kidnapped his innocent ex-girlfriend, torturing her for 3 days just to send him a message. He slaughtered the men who did it, salting the earth so completely their names became bad luck. But his ex could never look at his face again. Knowing she could be next, Alara still refused to leave.
You and I are stepping right into the shadows tonight, watching a tragedy quietly unfold in a room heavy with cigar smoke and bad intentions. Look at Ara. For 2 years, she survived the mob underworld by mastering the art of being invisible. A perfect ghost, but tonight that careful survival plan shatters, literally. A crystal glass breaks against the table of Dante Valli, a mafia boss who can end a life without raising his voice. The room goes dead tight. Everyone braces for a bloodbath. Instead, Dante just sits there. He simply watches her, his eyes cold and empty. It brings us to a harsh truth about true power. A loud threat is easy to brace for, but the silent, unblinking stare of a predator will break your spirit long before a hand is ever raised. Ara knows the single, unwritten rule of the criminal underworld. See too much, and you simply disappear. The air in the restaurant that night feels completely poisoned. Marcus, the floor manager, practically drags her into the dimly lit hallway. The man is a shaking mess, terrified out of his mind as he explains their VIP server just ran off. Ara has to fill in. He grips her shoulders, begging her to be nothing but a shadow. Keep your head down. Do not speak. Forget everything you hear. A freezing wave of pure dread washes through her chest. But here is a heavy truth we all have to face eventually. Sometimes, the heaviest and most terrifying burdens are dropped straight onto our shoulders at the exact moment we are desperately trying to run away. Every nerve in her body is screaming at her to turn around and run out the back door. But the crushing weight of her unpaid bills keeps her feet cemented to the floor. She swallows down the terror rising in her throat and picks up the heavy tray. Looking through the frosted glass, she studies the room. 6 silent enforcers, a woman in a sharp red dress, and sitting dead center is Dante Valli. He radiates a terrifying control. His crew sits close, hopelessly pulled into his gravity. He does not have to threaten anyone. The very air in the room bends around him. It is a haunting reminder of how fear really works. True power never has to raise its voice to make you tremble. It just sits quietly in the dark and waits for everyone else to break. Right beside her in the kitchen, an old line cook crosses himself at the mere mention of Dante. As if the devil himself had reserved a table, Ara locks her jaw, pushes the heavy doors open, and steps into the lion's den. She stares hard at the crystal glasses, moving rigidly. For a solid hour, she is the perfect ghost. These men sit there plotting violent crimes, treating her like she does not even exist. She shuts her mind off to survive the shift. It works perfectly until exhaustion betrays her. She makes one tiny mistake and glances up. Dante is already staring right back into her eyes. It is a brutal lesson about survival. You can spend years building a fortress to keep yourself safe, only to tear it all down with a single careless glance. Stick with me here, because you and I both know this is the moment everything unravels. Dante gives her nothing. His face is entirely blank. She cannot tell if he finds her amusing or if silently arranging her funeral. Those few seconds of eye contact stretch out like a lifetime. She rushes back to the kitchen, struggling to catch a breath. Marcus is panicked, but she pushes past him to grab the next bottle of wine. She forces herself back into the dining room. The woman in red exhales a thick cloud of smoke in her direction. As Aras reaches out, One of the guards suddenly shifts, knocking hard into her arm. The bottle slips. It is a tragic reality we all face under pressure. Fear will always make your hands betray you right when you need them to be steady. The glass bottle detonates against the table, splashing dark red wine across the white linen like a fresh crime scene. The music seems to stop. Ara forgets how to draw air into her lungs, paralyzed above the broken glass. She stammers out a desperate apology, but Dante cuts her off. He casually says it is perfectly fine. His voice is smooth, deep, and unnervingly calm. He slowly wipes at the spill, watching her heart beat out of her chest. When she tries to speak again, one dark look from him silences her completely. Then he forces his top enforcer, Carlo, to apologize to her. Carlo goes pale. There is a twisted truth in this. The most dangerous people do not just punish a mistake. They weaponize your fear to establish absolute dominance over everyone else in the room. Dante casually asks for another bottle as if nothing happened. Ara cannot feel her own legs. Her hands are trembling so violently, she nearly cuts herself on the broken glass. Marcus rushes in to clean the mess while the men casually resume their dark conversations. When Ara returns with fresh wine, she clutches it like her life depends on it. The weight of their stares is tearing her nerves to shreds. She forces the panic down and pours the drinks. As she quietly asks to be excused, Dante offers her a polite, faint smile. It feels exactly like a loaded gun pressed to her ribs. She collapses against the kitchen wall, gasping for air. It is a chilling human reality. A soft smile from a true monster will break your mind much faster than a screaming threat from an ordinary enemy. Another waitress hands her a glass of water, whispering that she just won the lottery of survival. But a dark thought is already taking root in her mind. Why would a ruthless boss show mercy to a nobody? This is exactly how the trap begins. We desperately look for warmth in the cold hands of the very predators meant to destroy us. Marcus corners her by the back exit, visibly shaken. He gives her a grim warning. Men like Dante do not forget a face once it catches their interest. The cold horror finally sets in. She is now on the radar of an apex predator. She promises to be careful and steps out into the freezing midnight air. Her car is 3 dark blocks away. It proves a bitter lesson. We often outrun one nightmare, only to walk blindly straight into another. She had parked in a pitch-black alley because she simply could not afford the lighted lot. Suddenly, the slow, heavy crunch of footsteps echoes behind her. She knows the oldest rule of survival. If you run, the predator will chase you. Ara forces herself to maintain a steady walk while her chest hammers in panic. A voice cuts through the freezing fog. She spins around to find one of Dante's men standing perfectly still. He casually mentions that the boss wanted to make sure she reached her car safely. The psychological manipulation is terrifying. He uses the fear of the dark streets to play the protective savior. Which brings us to a very dangerous life lesson. The absolute deadliest traps you will ever walk into are often beautifully disguised as heroic rescue missions. You and I have to pause here, because the real damage always sets in after the immediate danger fades. They walk the rest of the way in suffocating silence. Ara wants to scream and ask what they want from her, but her survival instinct keeps her quiet. She forces her key into the rusty car door lock. The enforcer leans against the hood, watching her hands shake. He softly tells her she is safe tonight, but adds a chilling warning. Next time, do not hold the glass so tightly. Ara nods, feeling like a complete hostage in her own life. She locks the doors and watches him fade into the fog. It reveals a dark irony about fear. Our instincts tell us to hide in the shadows to stay safe, but the shadows are exactly where the worst monsters are already waiting for us. Once she finally locks the deadbolt on her apartment door, her legs give out completely. Every fiber of her being tells her to pack a single bag, drive out of the city, and disappear. But the reality of her crushing debt keeps her chained to her life. The world does not care if you are running from ghosts. The rent is always due. She convinces herself she just needs to be a better shadow. She takes on double shifts, praying the sheer physical exhaustion will drown out her terror. But then Thursday arrives. The heavy wooden doors open, and Dante walks right back into the lobby. It is a brutal lesson about running away. You can pack your bags and flee to the edge of the world, but you can never hide from an enemy who has already mapped out your entire mind. Dante walks into the crowded dining room completely alone, wearing a dark suit and carrying a quiet, dangerous confidence. Ara freezes. The hostess leads the boss directly to her section. This is no accident. Predators always know exactly how to separate their target from the herd. Her mind begs her to run, but she stays rooted to the floor. He looks up at her with faint amusement, asking if she plans to just stare at him all night. Her hollow service voice takes over, asking what he would like to drink. "A scotch," he says, and tells her to surprise him. She scrambles away to fetch the best bottle they have. It shows a tragic flaw in our nature. When cornered by a true threat, we desperately try to prove our worth just to earn the right to survive. Picture the scene. Ara's hands are trembling so violently she grips her tray like a shield. She approaches the corner booth, where Vali sits bathed in the cold light of his phone. A quiet king in the shadows. She sets the glass down, her breathing shallow and panicked. Vali just smiles, complimenting the poor. His voice is thick with a terrifying, suffocating patience. Then comes the soft command, "Sit down." Every nerve in her body screams to run, but she collapses into the vinyl seat, stammering about being on the clock. He merely murmurs that he is only asking her to sit, flawlessly warping her reality. The lesson here is one we often learn too late. Real monsters do not hide in the dark with bared teeth. They pull out a chair for you with a perfectly polite smile. You and I need to look closely at this trap. Vali leans back and offers a soft apology. The word hits Ara in the chest. It is a stunning display of a predator feigning mercy. She searches his dark eyes, catching the violent scars near his temple. While he plays the weary traveler to perfection, he waves away the shattered bottle, smoothly shifting the blame to his associate. Then he praises her for keeping her composure, quietly conditioning her to swallow her terror. When she whispers that she is afraid, he nods slowly. "You only need to fear me if you give me a reason," he murmurs. It is an agonizing snare. The hardest truth in this world is that the one who shatters your reality often does it purely to become the only safe place you have left to stand. The moment her name slips from his lips, the noisy room fades into a ringing silence. Ara freezes. Vali leans in, asking her to book the back room for a private party. When she hesitates, he flashes a disarming smile. He mentions that she could use the money, brilliantly painting his influence as charity. Ara wants to walk away, but the crushing weight of her debts forces her to yield. For the rest of his meal, he becomes a ghost. He eats in silence, leaves a modest tip, and walks out. That mundane behavior is his sharpest blade. He erases her panic, trading it for a poisonous gratitude. Remember this when the night gets cold. A favor from a dark hand is never a gift. It is just an early down payment on your future loyalty. We have all felt that eerie calm before the storm. For Ara, the next few weeks are spent standing dead center in the eye of a hurricane. She works the lavish event, walking away with triple her normal wages. Every night she walks to her car in the dark, waiting for him to step out of the shadows. But Vali is gone. 2 unbroken weeks of agonizing silence. It is a calculated, emotional withdrawal. He is starving her out, forcing her mind to obsess over his absence. Ara tries to bury herself in the rhythm of double shifts, desperate to scrub his dark gaze from her memory. But the damage is done. The tragic lesson of human nature is that a sudden, quiet peace often feels like a vacant room. By disappearing, he ensures her safe, empty life feels hopelessly hollow without his terrifying attention. Isolation is the soil where predators plant their roots. By April, Vali returns to his dark corner booth. He murmurs her name, gesturing to the seat. Ara's exhausted body obeys without a single protest. He asks about her days with a smooth intimacy, casually mentioning her private catering shifts. Her blood runs cold. How could he know? Without blinking, he reveals he owns a share of the diner. Her sanctuary was always his hunting ground. He leans closer, asking why she works herself to the bone. She tries to build a wall, whispering that curiosity is dangerous. He just smiles. Only if you are careless, he replies. Never forget this bitter truth. A true master of the game will never ask you a question unless he already holds the exact answer. The room clatters around them, but Ara is trapped in a frozen vacuum. Defeated, she confesses the crushing weight of her debts. It is a cruel magic, how quickly we surrender secrets to a man who acts like he already knows them. Vali chips away at her armor, unearthing her buried love for art history. He watches the grief wash over her face, studying the regret in her eyes. This is not a casual chat. He is taking an inventory of her broken dreams. When she whispers that she gave up, he leans in, murmuring that those dreams might still matter. A customer waves, breaking the trance, and Ara flees with her heart hammering. The tragic lesson is clear. Dark figures will always locate your starved desires, patiently making themselves the one and only key to your salvation. Walk through this diner with me. The air is thick, the neon sign buzzing its lonely tune. When Ara returns to the corner booth, Vali has vanished. But sitting on the table are 5 crisp $100 bills. Her breath catches. She stares at the money that could solve her immediate problems. Marcus, a co-worker, whispers she would be a fool to leave it. Slowly, she slides the cash into her apron pocket. In that silent motion, the trap snaps shut. Vali returns every week after that, claiming his shadowy booth. He speaks softly of lost art, mapping the intricate architecture of her lonely mind. The lesson here aches to its core. Often, our desperate need to simply survive blinds us entirely to the fatal, invisible snares we willingly step right into. The warm May sun cannot thaw the chill settling into Ara's life. In a crowded cafe, her psychological shift is terrifying to witness. The dread Vali once provoked has warped into a twisted comfort. Her friend Jenna leans across the table, desperate to warn her. Jenna knows the street whispers, insisting this man's legacy is painted in blood, but Ara just tightens her jaw. She fiercely defends him, clinging to the illusion that he is merely a lonely soul who cares about her art. Yet, beneath the table, her knuckles are white as she grips her knees. Her subconscious knows the truth. Dante Varelli is a predator bleeding into her sanctuary. Listen closely to this bitter lesson. We will often fight with everything we have to protect the exact illusions destined to destroy us. The boundary line crumbles in an instant. Listen to the scrape of wood as Ara makes her move. Without an invitation, she slides into the booth opposite of him. She locks eyes with the devil, demanding to know why he haunts her corner every Tuesday night. Dante does not flinch. Instead, a low, melodic laugh escapes his chest. It is a masterful performance of warmth. He murmurs that she is the only soul who looks at him without calculating how to survive him. By stepping into his space, she seals her tragic fate. Her raw terror has mutated into a fatal, blinding curiosity. This is a haunting truth we must carry with us in the dark. The single most dangerous lie you can ever tell yourself is that you somehow get to be the one beautiful exception to a monster's violent rule. Stay with me, because this is the second the steel teeth finally close. Her voice drops to a frail whisper as she asks if she should be afraid. Dante holds her gaze and slowly nods. Then he draws his deadliest weapon, a partial truth. He confesses that honesty is a luxury he can rarely afford, wrapping himself in the cape of a tragic, isolated king. He twists the violence of his empire into a sorrowful burden, erasing his own ruthless choices. When she finally asks what he truly wants, a suffocating silence falls over the booth. The point of no return fades in the rearview mirror. This reveals a fatal flaw in the human heart. Pity is the heavy iron lock, and a shared sense of profound loneliness is the exact key that swings wide the door to our absolute ruin. The boiling heat of summer rolls in, bringing a terrifying psychological conditioning. Dante vanishes for stretches, only to reappear like a phantom. It is a deliberate starvation tactic, building a desperate craving for his presence. When he sits in her section, they trade whispered secrets. He talks about a sister in Boston, wearing the mask of an ordinary man to hide his savage reality. Ara memorizes his shifting moods, pouring scotch when his jaw is tight, and wine when he relaxes. But the true horror happens outside. Heavy, black sedans now idle under the streetlights by her apartment. The lesson here is enough to keep you awake. We adjust to the creeping darkness so slowly that our eyes completely forget what the morning sun ever looked like. Late June brings the snapping point. Ara finally confronts him about the shadowy men lingering outside her window. Dante does not blink. He casually admits the terrifying truth. She is simply too important to leave unguarded. Ara presses her trembling hands against the cold table, her nervous system in total meltdown. She begs for her freedom, weeping that she cannot survive the brutal rules of his dark world. But Dante slowly leans forward, erasing the final inches of space between them. He demands she say the word out loud, forcing her to voice the forbidden bond, chaining them together. The tragedy is sealed in blood. Here is our final, bitter lesson of the night. True captivity officially begins the exact second we agree to speak the name of the invisible chains holding us down. Picture this. It is long past midnight, the kind of dark that swallows you whole. Elara is huddled in the pitch black of the restaurant office. Through the thin drywall, the sickening thud of steel hitting bone echoes loudly. She cracks the door open a sliver. Tommy is backed into a corner, two enforcers looming over him with heavy pipes. His eyes beg for a miracle. We all know the smart play is to freeze. But here is a simple life lesson. We are dangerously wired to run into burning buildings to save others, completely forgetting we might burn alive ourselves. Panic takes over. Elara lunges for the alarm, but her foot betrays her on a loose floorboard. A sharp creak shatters the room. The men stop. They slowly turn around, dead silence. The predators just locked onto their new prey. The security alarm erupts, tearing through the night like a siren. A heavy hand shoves Elara against the plaster, and the room dissolves into terror. The air is thick with the scent of fresh blood and the awful sound of breaking bone. As the thugs are pulled away into the shadows, she stumbles backward, her shoulders hitting a solid chest. The mob boss himself, Dante, steps into the dim light. He plays the savior with terrifying perfection. He grips her arms, forcing her to meet his dead, freezing eyes. Listen closely, because here is a brutal life lesson. In moments of absolute panic, a desperate heart will easily mistake a well-built prison for a safe haven. Exhausted and terrified, she leans her weight right into the very monster who orchestrated this nightmare. She actually believes the worst is over. Red and blue lights flash through the broken windows. But inside, the air is heavy with pure corruption. The police actually take a step back. Dante is running the show now. Elara sits shivering under a thin blanket, unable to look away as he works the room. He uses a quiet, terrifying charm to silence the lead detective. You and I need to remember a simple life lesson here. You cannot plant a seed in poisoned soil, and you definitely cannot find peace in the shadow of a criminal. Yet her mind desperately clings to his protection. Marcus slumps into the chair beside her, his face pale and exhausted. He leans in and whispers the cold truth. Those men were not looking for cash. They were sending a bloody message to the true king of the underworld, Dante. Elara feels the ground drop out from under her. Dante owns every shadow in this city. His syndicate touches everything. She trembles the entire ride back, staring blankly as the streetlights blur past. Once she is locked inside her apartment, the silence becomes suffocating. She turns on the television for noise, but the dread stays right there in her chest. Here is a heavy life lesson. Real loneliness is not about being by yourself. It is the terrifying realization that you are unprotected in a ruthless world. Suddenly, her screen lights up in the dark, a single message from Dante. He calmly tells her to lock the doors, adding that his men are parked outside. Just like that, the invisible net snaps shut. He isolates her completely, making himself her only chance at survival. You and I can see this trap closing from a mile away. Dante gets on the phone, his voice deep and steady, slowly chipping away at her independence with perfectly placed guilt. Elara creeps over to her window and parts the blinds. Down on the empty street sits a dark sedan. Is that man a bodyguard or her new warden? Keep this simple life lesson in mind. Sometimes the exact hands shielding you from the storm are the very same hands building your cage. She stays awake until dawn, paralyzed by the lingering trauma. By 9, Dante calls back. He sounds incredibly gentle before casually mentioning he already cancelled her work shifts. A car is on the way. He stole her entire freedom overnight with one smooth move. She should be furious, but the anger just never comes. The slow poison of that trauma bond is taking deep root. Instead of fighting back as he hijacks her reality, Elara slumps her shoulders in pure exhaustion. She barely asks where he is taking her. The truth is, her own apartment feels like a haunted house now. Here is a simple life lesson. It is terrifying how quickly the mind will walk straight into a cage if the outside world feels too dangerous. At noon, a massive enforcer named Vincent pulls up. He never says a word. She slides into the tinted car and watches her normal life fade away through the dark glass. They arrive at a towering steel skyscraper, a freezing monument of extreme wealth. Vincent swipes a keycard, and the silent elevator pulls her straight up into the absolute heart of Dante's criminal empire. This penthouse is nowhere near a home. It is a freezing, sterile monument built for a massive ego, designed to make anyone else feel tiny. The huge windows offer a godlike view of the city. Dante stands silhouetted against the glass, looking every inch the villain. He turns and calmly lies to her face, telling her she can leave whenever she wants. He pours a glass of dark liquor, but she refuses to take it. Here is a major life lesson. Never accept a sweet drink that is only poured to blind you to the trap. Dante casually explains the brutal violence from last night. He names a rival family, brushing off the broken bones as just minor business friction. He takes a slow sip. His hand does not shake once. The man consumes human fear for a living, and he is not sweating at all. Dante locks onto her with dead eyes and calmly calls her a liability. He knows her greatest fear is getting people hurt, and he twists that knife with precision. Let this be a painful lifer lesson. The cruelest way to lock someone in a cage is to convince them they are the real danger to everyone else. He laughs off the police, reminding her that laws stop at the ground floor of his tower. When he casually orders her to stay put, something inside Elara finally snaps. Pure anger washes over her. She marches right up to him, shaking but defiant, demanding the truth. If she is forced onto his chessboard, she refuses to play blindfolded anymore. The room goes dead silent. Dante just stares at her, coldly calculating whether to manipulate her further or completely break her spirit. Notice how this icy penthouse perfectly mirrors Dante's twisted soul. It is massive, freezing, and empty. He paces the floor, talking about the upcoming gang war as if it is a shift in the weather. He mentions needing a firm understanding with his rivals. We all know that is just a pretty word for a massacre. His voice drops low, revealing the monster hiding beneath his expensive suit. Then comes the ultimate lie. He promises that if she stays quiet, she can return to normal once the smoke clears. Here is a profound life lesson. A truly dark soul will burn your entire world to ashes and then casually hand you the broom. A dry, bitter laugh escapes Elara's throat. She stares out at the heavy glass walls and finally accepts the terrifying truth. This golden cage is permanently sealed shut. Elara can barely keep her voice steady as she asks the question burning in her mind. Why is the king of the underworld so obsessed with a random waitress? Dante closes the distance in 3 smooth strides, radiating pure predatory energy. He leans down, his breath brushing her ear, and whispers that she makes him feel human. This is absolute top-tier manipulation. He takes the freezing void of his own soul and gently asks her to fix it. Remember this tragic life lesson. A gentle heart will completely bleed itself dry trying to heal a fundamentally broken monster. Right on cue, Elara starts carrying his emotional baggage as if it is her duty. By playing the wounded victim, this criminal mastermind ensures she will feel morally obligated to save him from his own darkness. The heavy weight of his psychological game hits her like a freight train. She is gasping for air, staring into his eyes, begging for 2 days to process this violent reality. But then comes the terrifying twist. As she stands there, Elara realizes she does not even want her old, safe life back. The toxic poison has taken full control. The trauma bond is setting like concrete in her chest. Throwing survival instincts away, she looks right at him and demands his darkest secrets. Dante steps into the harsh light. He openly admits to moving illegal shipments for a massive kingpin named Vittorio, his voice dripping with arrogance. And she does not run. Here is the most painful life lesson of all. Sometimes we willingly hug the exact fire that is going to burn us alive. She is ready for the underworld. Step into the shadows with me tonight, because you and I are watching a soul slowly dismantle itself. The dim light catches the cruel angles of Dante's face as he lists his sins. He spins a silky web, swearing he kept his bloody secrets just to protect her. When Ara finally chokes out the heaviest question, asking if he has ever taken a life, his answer drops like a stone in quiet water. Yes, that frozen word just hangs there. It should send her running. But look closely at her trembling shoulders. They actually relax. Her survival instinct is drowning, desperately painting this ruthless killer as a broken man who just needs love. The fragile lies we spin Espen to feel safe will always cut deeper than the brutal truth we are so desperate to outrun. Any rational person would feel the ice in their veins and bolt for the nearest door, desperate to escape a confessed murderer. But not our Ara. She looks entirely hollowed out, whispering like a sleepwalker as she asks for a tour of his gilded cage. Dante leads her through a sprawling maze of cold, cavernous bedrooms and pristine marble halls. It reeks of untouchable wealth, but it is completely dead inside. When she bravely calls out the quiet horror of the place, the untouchable boss actually flinches. He admits the mansion is nothing but a grand illusion designed to terrify his enemies. He traded his own soul just to wear the mask of a god. It reminds us that building massive walls to keep the monsters out usually leaves you locked inside, entirely alone with your own demons. It breaks my heart watching her try to bridge this massive gap. She actually compares his violent deceptions to the fake, tired smile she wears just to survive her retail shifts. It is a desperate, tragic reach for a connection that does not exist. While Dante orders dinner, we follow Ara drifting through the cavernous guest room. Her cheap, worn-out belongings look terribly lonely against his imported silk sheets. Back in the dim living room, he paces like a general on the eve of destruction. He drops the name Castellano, hyping up a massive clash scheduled for tomorrow at 2. He promises the crowded venue will prevent a massacre, but his cold eyes guarantee a bloodbath. Trying to find harmony with a walking disaster does not calm the storm. It just pulls you deeper into the crushing wreckage. When Ara asks how he carries the crushing weight of his dark empire, his answer is draped in a toxic, tragic melancholy. He paints himself as a martyr, the only man ruthless enough to hold back the true monsters of the city. In his fractured mind, his brutality is a noble sacrifice. 40 minutes later, they sit before a lavish spread of Thai food, the shimmering Chicago skyline glowing behind them. The quiet normalcy of it all is the most dangerous trap you could imagine. Dante softly brings up art, and Ara absolutely comes alive. She loses herself in the deep meaning of old paintings. With every eager breath, she hands this predator the master keys to her mind. Sharing your passions can forge a beautiful bond, but handing your heart to a snake only gives them the exact map to destroy you. The shadows soften around Dante's face, painting him as a gentle, attentive listener. He matches her rhythm perfectly, sinking his emotional hooks deep into her chest. Then comes the devastating blow. He whispers about a piano he used to play, a pure passion that died 15 years ago when his father was gunned down. It forced him to wear the heavy crown of the underworld. It is a breathtaking symphony of shared grief, and Ara drops her final shield. She looks at a violent killer and sees only a wounded artist. As they wash dishes, the warm water washes away the pure insanity of the moment. It is a quiet domestic dream built on a hidden landmine. Empathy is a profound gift, but you can never let your desire to heal someone blind you to the danger they bring into your life. Let us pause and look at this together. Ara wanders through the quiet penthouse, her eyes tracing a tiny painting of a misty forest. Right on cue, Dante steps from the shadows, his voice a low rumble. He confesses his late mother painted it. And just like that, the jaws of the trap snap shut. He feeds her a perfectly measured drop of childhood tragedy, and she swallows the poison willingly. Tears fill her eyes as she spills her own agony, telling him about the day her father died when she was only 12. Dante watches her with dark, focused eyes. He is not feeling her profound sorrow. He is calculating how to weaponize it. Vulnerability is meant to be a bridge between two honest souls. It should never be used as a crowbar to pry open a lonely heart and strip away its freedom. You can visibly see the physical exhaustion bleeding into her bones. Her voice trembles as she relives the cold beep of her father slipping away, a nightmare that left her starving for a powerful protector. Now, she is running on empty. Dante looms over her like a dark guardian, softly ordering her to sleep while he marches out to orchestrate a gang war. It is entirely suffocating. She desperately craves the warmth of the very man who dragged her into hell, confusing his iron grip for a loving embrace. She collapses into the lonely guest bed, and the deep rumble of his voice through the wall lulls her to sleep. Seeking comfort in the arms of the person destroying, you will only put your mind to rest right before the darkest chapter of your waking nightmare truly begins. 13 agonizing hours of dead silence slowly pass. When her eyes finally open, Dante is standing over her like the shadow of death himself. He is holding a cup of coffee crafted exactly the way she likes it, down to the final drop of cream. That kind of sharp observation is chilling. Ara breaks down, weeping about feeling like a ghost trapped in a cage. Dante taps his heavy watch and casually mentions he is leaving for the brutal showdown. He leaves his massive enforcer, Marco, to guard the heavy door. Her face twists in absolute terror, but not because she is a prisoner. She is terrified her captor might be killed. We grow so accustomed to the darkness we are trapped in that we start fearing the quiet emptiness of outliving the very monsters who's caused all our pain. The rich aroma of breakfast is just another quiet illusion to mask the cold reality of her captivity. When Dante turns to leave, draped in a sharp, immaculate suit, he looks like a dark king marching to the gallows. He pulls her into a tight embrace and whispers his gratitude for her trust. The bitter irony is that she never had a choice. He methodically burned her world to ash until he was the only warm thing left standing. By pretending she chose this life, he locks the final chain around her mind. As the heavy door clicks shut, Ara stands paralyzed. She does not look for a window or a weapon. She only worries for the man who ruined her. When you let someone sever your ties to the world, you will inevitably confuse your total dependence on them for genuine love. You and I can hear that heavy clock ticking, hammering away at her fragile sanity. Ara paces the long stretch of the penthouse like a frantic, caged bird. Right at 2 o'clock, the muscle, Marco, heavily steps into the frame. He sinks into a chair with a book, pretending to be a quiet observer, but he is a living brick wall sealing her fate. The silence is thick enough to choke on. Ara tries to sketch, but her hands violently shake from the raw dread eating her from the inside out. Then, right at 5, the phone screams and shatters the air. Dante barks his orders, commanding her to pack her bags immediately. He keeps her blood pumping so fast she cannot think straight. If you keep someone running on a treadmill of sheer panic, they will never realize you are the one holding the leash. This is the tragic moment. Her former life is erased completely. Dante's voice crackles over the phone, dropping the heavy news that the rival syndicate discovered her quiet apartment. True or false, the reality does not matter anymore. Her sanctuary is gone. Dante smooths over the panic by casually offering to absorb her into his shadows, promising to replace her lost wages with his bloody money. It is a terrifying power play, fastening a velvet collar tightly around her throat. Ara collapses, weeping uncontrollably. She does not care about his massive fortune. She just wants the quiet safety of her old, boring life back. But that world is burning, leaving her clinging to the man holding the matches. We often ignore our mundane routines until it all shatters, leaving us desperate for a normal day. Stay close for this final descent into madness, because the tragedy is overwhelming. Ara is sobbing, pleading for just 1 second to catch her breath. Dante coldly grants her a single hour, but the cruelest joke of all is that she has nowhere else to run. Marco silently approaches and places a cold drink in her trembling hands. The alcohol slowly numbs her racing mind, dragging her deeper into this beautifully decorated prison. Look into her tearful eyes as she starts asking this hired gun about his 10 years serving the boss. She is desperately searching his face for any proof that her captor might possess a soul. When we are drowning in fear, our minds will play the ultimate trick, convincing us that the heavy stone dragging us into the dark is actually the boat meant to save us. Picture this absolute madness unfolding in the shadows. Marco sits there, feeding Ara the exact toxic validation her bruised soul is completely desperate to hear. He swears that Dante, a mafia boss carved from pure ruthlessness, magically turns into a softie just for her. It is the classic trap of thinking she can fix him, and she is falling for it hard. Drunk on this fake sense of control, Ara actually tries to negotiate her own surrender. She asks for tiny crumbs of freedom, like just stepping outside or demanding the truth about the mob violence at their doorstep. She thinks she is making a boss move, but it is only a tragic plea for respect. The lesson here hits deep. Sometimes, when we think we are setting firm boundaries, we are really just measuring the exact dimensions of our very own cage. You and I need to stop and look at how perfectly this trap snaps shut. Dante lets a heavy silence hang in the air, playing the part of a man hesitant to agree. Then he flashes a disarming smile to lock down her fragile trust, dropping the most dangerous word a lonely person can hear: home. They roll through the sleeping city straight to his fortress. It looks like a cozy brownstone, but do not let the warm lights fool you. It is a high-security vault. The massive iron gates slam shut behind them, swallowing their car without a single witness. Ara walks straight into total isolation, and the wildest part is she chose it. It is a harsh truth we all have to learn. Safety handed to you by a violent predator is never an actual sanctuary. It is just a prison built with much softer pillows. This scene is a total shift. You would expect a ruthless boss to have a cold, sterile lair. Instead, his secret apartment is warm and a chaotic mess. Tossed jackets, stacks of old books, and crusty coffee mugs are everywhere. It makes zero sense for a man dedicated to strict control. Dante brings Ara inside, looking insanely awkward for a guy who normally orders hits before his morning coffee. Then, Ara spots the old family photos on the wall. Faded pictures of his mom and little sister sit there like quiet ghosts from a past life. Dante freezes in the doorway, totally exposed for a fraction of a second. The lesson here is impossible to miss. No matter how far into the dark a person goes, they always leave tiny pieces of their lost humanity hiding right there in plain sight. Watch closely as the terrifying boss loses his swagger. Dante nervously offers her food, and his intimidating mobster vibe crumbles. Ara declines his awkward attempts to play host, pushing him to confess that he never shares his space. For 5 long years, this man has lived in self-imposed exile. He locks out even his loyal soldiers because he is terrified of a knife in the back. It is pure paranoia. But then Ara makes a soft joke about not judging his messy book collection, and a spark of relief softens his dark eyes. She quietly unpacks her bag, pulling out just a sketchbook and 2 thin shirts. It leaves us with a profound life lesson. Total isolation will slowly drive a person insane, But one tiny moment of real human connection can instantly tear down years of paranoid defense. Her tiny pile of belongings looks incredibly sad, dumped on his expensive furniture. It is the physical proof of a life destroyed by trauma. Ara walks into the kitchen and catches the feared Don without his custom suits, just wearing regular denim. The vibe shifts instantly. They sit down with glasses of dark red wine, the silence between them heavy. Ara brings up his bitter rival, Castellanos, and Dante goes ice cold. He casually admits he stalked the rival's young daughter at school, just to force a truce. Ara is disgusted by the calculated ruthlessness, even though Dante swears he was never going to hurt the kid. His mind games are chilling. It brings up a grim life lesson. People with absolute power are almost always the first to use the innocence of others as twisted leverage. Stick with me here. We need to unpack Ara's reaction. Dante looks her in the eyes and says his enemies see her as a massive weak spot. His solution? Pure mob boss ego. He promises absolute violence against anyone who looks at her, talking about murder like he is ordering a pizza. Any rational person would run for the door. But Ara feels a twisted wave of relief wash over her. We are watching Stockholm Syndrome spawn right in front of us. Her traumatized brain is flipping pure terror into gratitude. She finds comfort in the biggest monster in the room, just because he promises to fight off the other monsters. It is a heartbreaking truth about human nature. Sometimes we are so desperate for a safe place to hide, we will gladly walk right back into the exact fire that burned us in the first place. Dante drops a heavy bomb, confessing that without his violent reputation, he is nothing. His fractured ego is glued together by sheer dominance. Ara wants to tell him there is another way to live, but she is too broken to speak up. Instead, she asks for one real secret that has nothing to do with the mafia. Dante hands over the most calculated piece of vulnerability imaginable. He softly admits he is terrified of dogs because of an incident with a German shepherd when he was a kid. Yes, the most lethal mob boss in the city is afraid of puppies. Ara loses it, cracking up at how beautifully absurd that is. It is an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation. The lesson here is genuinely scary. The most dangerous predators know exactly which cute, harmless weaknesses to show off to make you feel completely safe. The spotlight flips to Ara, spilling her crushed dream of running an art museum. For a second, you hear real passion in her voice. Then she instantly tears herself down, blaming her father's debts and acting like she was never good enough. It is a classic survivor move, making yourself small so the world cannot hurt you. But Dante is not having it. He forcefully rejects her broken narrative and praises her raw talent, pointing out how her face lights up when she talks about art. He completely shatters her belief that she is a failure. Panicking because she feels way too seen by this ruthless mob boss, Ara awkwardly changes the subject to his sister. The life lesson here is massive. Validating someone's hidden potential is the absolute fastest way to hack straight past their thickest emotional walls. Dante brings up his sister, and his vibe gets incredibly heavy. He admits she offered him a clean way out after their old man died, but he sprinted straight into the criminal underworld instead. He ruthlessly roasts his younger self, calling out the arrogant thought that he could run a bloody mafia empire and keep a clean conscience. He drops a hard fact about his world. You cannot just dip your toes in the dark. It either completely eats you alive or you die. The silence following that confession is suffocating. Desperate to kill the tension, Dante pivots back to cooking dinner, pulling Ara into the kitchen like they are just some normal couple. This highlights a deadly life lesson. The most inescapable traps we stumble into are the ones we arrogantly think we can walk away from whenever we choose. This is where the dynamic completely shatters. Dante brutally shuts down Ara's desperate attempt to turn him into a misunderstood bad boy. He lays his dark resume out plain and simple. He catches bodies. He runs a violent crime syndicate. He is the monster his mother warned everyone about. But Ara is so buried in Stockholm Syndrome that she ignores the giant red flags. She hypes up his protective side to justify catching feelings. The sheer denial is insanity. Dante cannot even process her blind loyalty. Frustrated, he storms across the room and kisses her like a madman. It is a wild mix of heavy guilt and total toxic possession. The life lesson here: we constantly project fake goodness onto deeply broken people, simply because looking at their actual darkness is way too terrifying for our minds to handle. You and I have to pause and look at this piece by piece. We are watching the ultimate toxic push and pull unfold in real time. Dante drops a weak apology for kissing her. Do not be fooled. It is just a calculated flex of fake vulnerability. And how does Ara react? She steps right up and pulls him straight back into a desperate hug. We are witnessing the exact tragic second a trauma bond gets locked in permanently. She whispers that she does not care about the life-threatening danger of his mafia lifestyle anymore. The life lesson here leaves an incredibly bitter taste. When someone is completely starved for a tiny bit of human attention, they will happily walk right into the direct line of fire just to feel seen for once. Her broken self-esteem makes her the absolute perfect target for his unhinged mobster ego. Watch her fragile brain rewrite reality right in front of our eyes. Ara grabs his face with shaking hands, verbally deleting his identity as a ruthless mafia enforcer. She tells him she only sees the man, ignoring the blood-soaked monster standing right there in her kitchen. This is her trapped mind going into overdrive, aggressively romanticizing her captor just to cope. Dante kisses her again. It feels like half a romantic promise and half a terrifying mob threat, firmly locking down his dominance. Then they casually go back to cooking dinner like nothing happened. The cozy domestic vibe is wildly unsettling compared to her mental prison. The lesson here is genuinely terrifying. We will normalize absolute insanity just to survive the day. Every tender touch at that dinner table is really just another invisible chain locking her to a certified sociopath. Picture this, late-night listeners. Outside those heavy oak doors, Dante is running an absolute bloodbath of a mafia empire, barking orders into the dark. But step inside with me. Look at Ara. She is curled up on that leather sofa, eyes wide, breathing in the cold air of pure terror. The doors click open and the room goes dead silent. Dante leans against the frame. He rubs his temples, pulling off an absolute masterclass in looking completely drained. He whispers that he just wants to survive the night. Suddenly, the shadows paint as a tragic hero, not a ruthless mob boss. Stick with me, because you and I are going to unpack this performance together. The lesson here is brutal but true. The worst predators do not kick the door down. They stumble in, playing the exhausted, misunderstood victim. Ara is running on fumes, her mind fraying at the edges. Dante steps in and scoops her up like she weighs absolutely nothing, carrying her to that massive, cold bed. Listen to me carefully. This is 100% calculated dominance, dressed up as a sweet romantic rescue. And she is falling for it blindly, gripping his dark jacket, begging him not to leave her alone in the dark. He feeds her a fake warning about how toxic he is, knowing exactly how reverse psychology plays out. She bites the hook. whispering that he just needs someone to believe in him. It is a slow-motion disaster. The simple lesson in this life is one we often ignore. Trying to put a completely shattered person back together usually just leaves you bleeding from their broken edges. He kisses her forehead, sealing the trap. Morning breaks, but the sun barely manages to bleed through those massive tinted windows. Ara is wandering alone in this giant, beautiful cage, with Marco standing guard outside like an iron statue. She steps into a shadow and finds a grand piano, thick with dust. Nervous, she presses a single white key. The note echoes. The air in the room instantly turns to ice. Dante is suddenly standing in the doorway, stiff and terrifying, making her freeze in her tracks. She stammers out an apology, just for making a sound. He stares her down and coldly states that he does not play music anymore. Look, we can take a real lesson from the heavy silence he carries. When you choose a path paved with violence, you bury every soft, beautiful thing inside yourself, becoming a walking ghost. But watch what happens next. She does not back down from that freezing glare. Instead, she actually pushes this hardened killer to sit at the bench, and Dante plays along. For a man who destroys lives before breakfast, he pulls the vulnerable card with terrifying ease. His scarred hands touch the keys, pouring out a messy, deeply emotional Chopin piece. It makes him look wounded and romantic, hiding the unhinged reality of who he is. She falls right into the illusion, whispering that the music is beautiful. He gives a dark little smirk, muttering that even monsters have hobbies. Her defenses crumble to dust. This brings us to a harsh truth. A sad melody never erases a violent past. Charm and talent are just the velvet gloves dangerous people wear to get a firm grip on your life. Right here, Ara is building the bars to her very own cage. She looks at him and says, even dark souls deserve a little light, basically crowning herself as his personal savior. Dante seals the moment with a slow, heavy kiss, straight up warning her that he will destroy her, but she is so lost in the fantasy, she thinks it is a promise of love. Let us look at this together, you and I. They spend hours playing house in the quiet afternoon, but as soon as it falls, the mob boss comes back to life. He casually mentions that the whole crime family will know she belongs to him tonight. He is marking his territory. The brutal lesson here is impossible to look away from. When a dangerous man builds a massive iron wall to protect you, he is actually just building your permanent prison. The weight of his words finally lands, and it is a tragedy to watch. He looks at her with those dead, freezing eyes, telling her the underworld now sees her as his actual property. Any sane person would run for the hills. But Ara gets this soft, starry-eyed look. She actually feels chosen. Dante whispers that having her around makes him look human to the wolves outside, playing the terrified boy who needs her warmth. She is entirely lost to him now. She traded a wide-open future to be the anchor for a violent king. We have to sit with this train wreck for a second. The sad reality of trying to save a drowning soul is that you almost never pull them to the shore. More often than not, you just become the heavy stone they drag down to the dark bottom of the ocean. The story plunges into its darkest hour right here. Dante is literally weaponizing his own trauma. Ara begs for the raw truth, totally convinced her love can handle his inner demons. The shadows hide half his face as he drops the nightmare of Maria, his former love dragged from her home and locked in a black box for 3 agonizing years. He paints this gruesome, bleeding picture, completely flipping the script, so he becomes the tragic victim instead of the monster. Ara ends up feeling like she is the rare exception, diving headfirst into his suffocating dark. Honestly, The lesson hiding in these shadows is bitter. A truly broken person will happily dig up the bones of their past tragedies just to build a psychological cage around the one they want to keep trapped today. Dante pulls away slowly, his jaw ticks, and his voice drops to a dead, hollow hum. He tells her how Maria survived the physical torture, but her mind snapped, leaving her to vanish like smoke. This is a massive red flag painted in actual blood. Ara asks if he ever found the men who did it, and his eyes go totally blank. He casually describes wiping them off the earth, turning the men, their families, and their homes into grey ash. Total, ruthless ruin. A healthy mind would bolt for the nearest exit, but her feet are cemented to the floor. It is a terrifying flaw in the human heart. We can stare directly into a blazing fire of pure, unhinged violence, and somehow convince ourselves we are just feeling the comforting warmth of true love. This is the exact second the steel trap snaps shut over her soul. Anyone else would have broken a window to escape into the night. But watch her step closer. She buries her face against his chest, entirely erasing the line between a normal life and his bloody war zone. She genuinely believes standing next to the devil is safer than hiding behind his guards. When his massive arms finally crush around her, shaking with adrenaline, she misreads his violent tremors as a desperate cry for affection. She promises they will burn in this fire together, handing over her entire identity. She locked her own cage from the inside. It is a painful truth to swallow. You truly lose yourself the moment you tie your own survival to the very storm that is destined to tear you apart. Notice how that one heavy word just hangs in the cold air. He calls her his girl. It is a mafia brand burned straight onto her life, but instead of panic, it sends a warm thrill of submission right down her spine. She whispers a promise to stay, sealing the deal in invisible blood. Later, hiding in the dark guest room while he runs his criminal empire through the walls, she stares at the ceiling. She thinks about the sheer insanity of sleeping under the roof of a killer, waiting for a gang war to erupt at dawn. But the toxic roots are already planted too deep. The scariest trick our own minds can pull is taking a pitch-black descent into a living nightmare and wrapping it up in the warm, deceitful illusion that we have finally come home. You and I have to pause here and really look at her lying in the dark. Listening to the violent rumble of his voice through the drywall, she feels a sick, twisted sense of peace. But when dawn breaks, reality hits her like a freight train. She is essentially a hostage getting dressed for a mafia war. She puts on dark, shapeless clothes, trying to shrink away from the coming violence. She walks into the kitchen, and there he is. Dante is wearing a sharp, custom suit, looking like a flawless king of ruin. He sees her shaking hands, and his voice drops to a low rumble of pure arrogance, promising that everyone will bow to her simply because he demands it. The saddest truth in life is that we sometimes learn to adore the monster, just hoping he decides not to eat us. Dante promises that anyone who disrespects her will simply cease to exist, saying it as casually as checking the morning weather. He grabs her waist, pulling her against his chest in a terrifying display of total ownership. He commands her to never look down again, claiming his shadow makes her untouchable. The scene cuts to the harsh fluorescent lights of an abandoned warehouse, where dozens of hardened men circle a giant metal table. The second Dante walks through those heavy iron doors, gripping her hand like a vice, the entire room goes dead silent. Let us get this entirely straight. He is not holding her hand out for sweet romance. He is parading his newest prize. Because honestly, a king's absolute power means nothing without an audience terrified enough to watch him use it. Picture Ara standing there, a fragile silhouette caught in a room full of wolves. We are watching the last pieces of her quiet life turn to ash. For years, she was a ghost in her own story. Yet here, surrounded by ruthless killers, she actually lifts her chin. She mistakes this desperate defiance for bravery. In reality, she is a drowning woman wrapping her arms around the shark, pulling her under. Dante tightens his hold, letting a chilling silence fall over the syndicate. He promises death to anyone who even looks her way. One soldier dares to shift, and Dante shatters him with a single glare. It brings us to a quiet truth. True strength only grows when you stand on your own 2 feet. You never find real power by hiding in the shadow of the man who built your cage. The tension in this cold room is absolutely suffocating. Dante locks his jaw and claims Ara as his own, a possessive move that slams down like a heavy iron gate. Tonight, you and I are going to unpack this tragedy unfolding in the shadows. Elena leans in, quietly asking if Ara understands the endless cycle of violence she is signing her soul over to. Ara is shaking down to her bones. But staring straight into the hollow eyes of her captor, she keeps her voice steady and whispers that she chooses this cage. Elena offers a sad smile, misreading Ara's frantic survival mode as romantic bravery. It is a heavy scene that hits us with a harsh truth. We often mistake our desperate need to survive for free will, eventually falling in love with the exact toxic cages we can never escape. The lighting shifts, casting long shadows across Dante's face as he cements his status as king of this underworld. He introduces his inner circle, and we watch Ara's eyes widen in horror. Standing right there is the exact man who once broke her. The blood instantly drains from her face. Her fragile mind violently pulls the plug on reality to keep breathing. The men stare her down, silently marking her as his personal property. She should be suffocating under that heavy ownership. Instead, her broken spirit twists the terror into a shield, believing this total loss of freedom is her only way to stay alive. The lesson here is agonizing. Strip away someone's safety, and they will blindly run to find warmth in the very hands that destroyed their world. The sheer weight of this underground empire crashes down on Ara's chest. With a chilling flick of his wrist, Dante motions for her to sit, managing her exhaustion as if she is just another liability on his ledger. The warmth he showed her earlier is entirely gone. Now, there is only the terrifying syndicate boss, ready to crush anyone who steps out of line. Yet instead of running for the door, Ara sinks deeper into the quicksand of this trauma bond. She finds a sick comfort in being chosen by the apex predator everyone else fears. Elena lingers behind, softly warning Ara not to let this darkness consume her. But the wheels are already in motion. It brings us to an undeniable truth. You cannot warm yourself by a radioactive fire without slowly losing the best parts of your own soul. Elena leans across the table, whispering that Dante is actually a decent man, chained to a dark legacy. You and I both know that is the classic excuse used to protect absolute monsters. When Dante returns, Ara completely folds, confessing how terrified she really is. His response is perfectly calculated. He gently strokes her hair, rewarding her submission and pulling her deeper into his shadow. The scene cuts to a lavish restaurant, spinning the bizarre illusion of a normal lunch date. Ara eats it right up, trying to ignore the blood on the hand sitting across from her. But that sinister hum never leaves the background. Keep this in mind as we watch her fall. A quiet moment in a toxic relationship does not mean you are finally safe. It just means the monster is taking a breath. The camera pushes in as Ara dares to ask about the assassination of the previous Don. Dante's own father, the tragic father-son dynamic hangs heavy, but Dante does not flinch. There is zero grief in his eyes, only the cold calculus of the empire he inherited from a man who barely loved him. He admits his early mistakes almost burn the syndicate down, a rare slip of vulnerability, instantly buried under arrogance. When asked about regrets, his dead-eyed silence violently fills the space. Ara is drowning so deep in her trauma that she scrambles to defend his brutal choices, framing his cruelty as survival. The sad reality here is one we see too often. We will rewrite a villain's entire morality just to justify why we are still standing next to them. Sunlight spills across the pavement as they walk through a quiet neighborhood. To any stranger, it looks like romance, but the camera pulls back, revealing Marco trailing them like a grim reaper. Dante is an apex predator disguised in plain sight. He whispers to Ara that this illusion of being invisible is their armor. This is where her mind fractures. After a lifetime of being collateral damage, she finds an addictive comfort in his terrifying influence. Walking next to the most dangerous man in the city makes her feel bulletproof. It is a tragic symptom of deep emotional damage. People will twist their own reality into knots just to feel protected, but the hard truth remains. You are never truly safe when your fortress is built by the exact monster you should be running from. The heavy door slams shut as Dante leaves, giving Ara a tiny slice of peace. She traces the piano keys, trying to summon the ghost of the girl she was before this nightmare. But that sanctuary shatters the second he steps back inside. He crashes her quiet solo, laying his hands over the keys and bleeding his dark energy into her safe space. Stick with me here, because this is where the illusion rots away. This is not a beautiful duet. A controlling man cannot stand watching his victim find joy unless he is the one manufacturing it. They share a laugh over a clumsy note, and her cage fades into the melody. Here is a lesson we all need to carry. Real love means giving someone the air to breathe, not aggressively claiming every single inch of their personal world. That domestic peace shatters in an instant. The phone rings, slicing through the room like a sniper shot. Dante morphs from a gentle companion to a cold-blooded killer in the blink of an eye. A rival crew just torched his operation, and Ara's panic spikes hard. She asks what his next move is, but pure vendetta is already carved into his jawline. Retribution is the only language this man understands. He orders Marco to lock her up. When he turns around, she stares into the pitch-black abyss of his eyes. A sane person would run. Instead, her trauma takes the wheel. She breaks down, begging the monster to come back to her in one piece. The tragedy of it all? We get so broken that we desperately look for safety in the exact raging fires guaranteed to burn our lives to ash. Notice how effortlessly he weaponizes her attachment. His features soften, whispering a dark promise to return. It is a masterclass in locking down her loyalty before he steps out to commit murder. He leaves her in the dark with Marco. To the world, Marco is a bodyguard, but here, he is simply the warden. Left in the suffocating silence, Ara loses her grip. Marco casually remarks that Dante is the real monster, sending her frantic mind into a tailspin. She is terrified of the Don, yet convinced her survival depends on him. Every pair of headlights sweeping across the wall feels like an execution squad pulling up. The lesson hits hard in the lonely hours. Total, relentless isolation will eventually make you crave the very poison that is ending your life. We are going to look at this turning point together, because this is where the line is crossed permanently. Ara sprints across the room on pure panic. Dante steps into the dim light, his shirt heavily soaked in dark blood. Any rational person would bolt, but Ara rushes forward, desperately checking his chest for wounds. His face is a stone wall, devoid of emotion. He confesses he just slaughtered an entire rival family. 12 bodies, gone. He stares into her soul and weaponizes her guilt, claiming he did this solely to keep her safe. Her trauma bond has completely devoured her moral compass. Instead of screaming, she buries her face in the chest of a killer. The truth is terrifying. When you lose your own identity, you will gladly build a home inside the darkest of hearts. Looking back at the wreckage of this story, we search for the exact second her spirit broke for good. For Ara, it begins with a shaking breath and a whispered apology. She is crying into his blood-soaked shirt, telling the murderer she is sorry. It is the ultimate hostage reaction, a desperate play to calm a ticking bomb. Her frantic words hang heavy in the room, a futile attempt to soothe the cold energy radiating off him. She is begging forgiveness over a 12-man massacre she had no part in, pouring the final layer of cement over her psychological cage. She believes absorbing his sins will somehow cure the demon inside of him. We must learn from this quiet tragedy. You can never heal a toxic person by taking the blame for the chaos they deliberately choose to cause. Look closely at this midnight hour, and you will see the sheer arrogance dripping from Dante. He tilts his head in the dim light, posing as some untouchable god of the underworld. He leans in, completely erasing Ara's mausoleum in just 3 agonizing seconds. He tells her this violence was destiny, and she was merely the key to uncage his inner beast. You and I are witnessing pure psychological destruction. He frames his darkness as a force of nature. The shadows consume the room, leaving her gazing at him with tragic devotion. The worst monsters do not just break your spirit, they rewrite the narrative until you believe you invited the pain. Listen to me tonight. If anyone ever shrinks your worth to justify their own toxic shadows, walk away before you lose yourself completely. Let the slow piano chords drift in as we examine this tragic moment. We are pulled close to an apex predator faking a mortal wound. Dante slumps his shoulders, a portrait of staged defeat, and buries his face in Ara's hair. He drops a hollow whisper, pleading for a shower, turning his calculated breakdown into a weapon. By playing the broken man, he hijacks her empathy and silences her survival instincts. Ara swallows her terror, murmuring a soft agreement. She is so traumatized that the violent monster vanishes, replaced by a bleeding soul begging for grace. It is a devastating trap. The quiet lesson here is one we often learn too late. The most dangerous cages we will ever inhabit are the ones we willingly unlock for the broken people we desperately want to save. Step into the heavy atmosphere of this room, where the air is heavy with the metallic scent of ruin. As Dante pulls back, Ara confronts the gruesome reality. His dark shirt is soaked in crimson, clinging to his hands like a terrifying second skin. This is the agonizing aftermath of an underworld execution. A normal heart would shatter, screaming for an escape. But Ara remains totally paralyzed in the shadows. Her fragile mind simply shuts down the horror, wrapping her consciousness in a blanket of ice just to survive the moment. It is a deeply melancholic reminder for all of us navigating the dark. When your heart simply cannot bear the nightmare standing right in front of you, your mind will build a cold fortress of ice just to keep the madness at bay. "Join me," he murmurs, and though it sounds like a desperate plea, do not be fooled. It is a chilling command. Notice how the shadows frame this suffocating space, because there is no romance breathing here. Dante refuses to stand alone with the screaming ghosts of the lives he just ended. He desperately needs Ara as his pure anchor, dragging her into the thick steam to forcefully wash the guilt from his skin. Now, her trembling hands permanently carry the dark stain of his sins. We are watching an agonizing trauma bond solidify in real time. The midnight truth here is a heavy one to carry. When you choose to step into the dark and help a toxic person wash away their terrible mistakes, you will inevitably end up wearing their suffocating guilt as your own. They stand together under the scalding water, swallowed by the most agonizing silence you can imagine. The view drifts to the drain, capturing thick ribbons of dark red spiraling away before fading to clear. Ara is visibly trembling, her hands moving mechanically over his scarred back, scrubbing away the brutal evidence of his midnight sins. Dante remains completely still, eyes closed, absorbing her touch like a fallen king demanding tribute. It is a heartbreaking portrait of psychological surrender. By washing away his horror, she quietly validates his madness. Please hold this painful lesson close tonight. The moment you begin cleaning up the terrible wreckage of someone else's cruelty, you silently accept it as a permanent fixture in your own life. Once the brutal mess is washed away, a dangerous illusion of safety settles into the heavy air. The harsh light casts agonizing shadows across the dripping tiles. Dante steps out without a word, leaving Ara shivering beneath the fading warmth. Her eyes are devastatingly hollow, locked onto the cold porcelain as her mind fights to unsee the nightmare she just touched. The physical blood may be gone, but the invisible psychological stain is now crushing her fragile shoulders. She dries off in pure silence, drifting like a captive ghost through a fortress she cannot escape. This brings us to a deeply tragic truth. You and I know that while you can easily scrub away the physical remnants of a dark night, the heavy emotional trauma will permanently stain your soul. Listen closely, because this is the exact moment the velvet trap snaps shut. Dante works behind her back, forging her admission into an elite college. When she rightfully burns with anger, he drops to one knee. Notice how the lighting shifts, painting him in a soft, cinematic glow. From this calculated angle of submission, he delivers a heartbreaking speech about restoring her stolen dreams and paying the tuition. Ara is overwhelmed, and we watch her righteous fury melt into tearful gratitude. She believes she just secured her ultimate freedom, utterly blind to the cold iron bars sliding into place. Here is the harsh, midnight reality check we all need. Absolute control almost always wears the beautiful, sparkling mask of romantic generosity. See how beautifully her deepest ambitions are weaponized. She is starving for independence, and this poisoned bait is too sweet to resist. The second she breathes her surrender, a victorious smirk pulls at Dante's lips. He casually drops the anchor, declaring she will be staying with him for a long time. Tragically, she mistakes this terrifying vow of ownership for a passionate confession of romance. The story then violently fractures her reality. By day, she sits in sunlit lecture halls, debating art with innocent students. By night, she slips into the heavy sheets of a ruthless crime boss who orders assassinations with a simple nod. The late-night lesson is painful but true. Trying to juggle a violently fractured double life will inevitably lie split your fragile soul right down the middle. The scene shifts to a bustling campus cafe, but Ara has never looked more agonizingly alone. She sits in the golden sunlight, surrounded by classmates whining about weekend parties. Ara paints on a hollow smile, desperately suffocating the ticking time bomb in her chest. When a girl jokingly asks if Ara is secretly in witness protection, the blood instantly drains from her face. She forces out a dry laugh to mask her rising panic, quickly pivoting the conversation to throw them off the scent. She is actively carving away pieces of her real self to protect the monster, keeping her in a gilded cage. Keep this midnight truth in your heart. Guarding a highly toxic secret will always demand the slow, painful sacrifice of your true identity. Ara wanders through the fading light, carrying the heavy realization that these laughing students could never fathom the brutal underworld she returns to. Stepping into the dim silence of Dante's penthouse, the tragedy reaches a breaking point. Exhausted from wearing a suffocating mask all day, she collapses into the arms of the very man destroying her life. Dante slowly strokes her hair, his deep baritone rumbling as he forbids her from speaking of his world. He is a master architect of despair, spinning her profound isolation into a dark romance, feeding her elegant lies to keep her anchored. Listen closely, because we need to spot this tragic red flag. Seeking comfort from the exact person causing your deepest pain is a fast track to losing yourself completely in the dark. The atmosphere shifts, plunging us into the freezing depths of his psychological torment. Dante paces the shadows like a caged predator, actively testing the limits of her devotion. He casually remarks that his mafia circle views her as too weak for his blood-soaked world. When Ara claims she knows what she signed up for, he shatters her illusion without mercy. He steps close, forcing her to imagine the cold steel of a loaded gun pressed firmly against her temple. He demands her survival plan for when his enemies inevitably kick down her door. The warmth drains from her face as the romantic fog evaporates, leaving only paralyzing terror. Let this final lesson sink in tonight. Ignoring early red flags only guarantees you will eventually face a deadly storm without any shelter. Listen closely, friends, because this is the exact moment the tragedy is carved into stone. Dante takes a slow step back, gesturing to the open door, literally offering Ara a clean break. But you and I both know the game is rigged from the start. He's already planted the psychological locks deep inside her mind. She doesn't run. Instead, her hands tremble as she reaches up, swearing she will never leave. Dante kisses her with this desperate hunger, masking his terrified obsession with keeping her caged. Soon, her inner ruin bleeds onto her canvases. A wild clash of classical martyr and modern cruelty. A silent, stunning scream for help. The painful truth here: your mind will always find a way to leak the deep trauma you refuse to speak about out loud. The warmth of her old studio is completely dead, replaced by this suffocating nightmare atmosphere. Ara is drowning under half-finished canvases, surviving on stale coffee and pure panic. Then, Dante appears, leaning casually in the doorway like a shadow. He watches her mental collapse with this twisted, clinical fascination before stepping in and snatching the brush away like a disappointed parent. Ara just stares up at him. Her eyes are hollow, completely convinced she has to work herself to the bone just to repay the dirty money he forced on her. She is trading her sanity for his toxic approval, bit by bit. It leaves us with a stark reality to remember. Burning yourself out to prove your worth to someone who manipulates you will eventually destroy every beautiful thing you hold inside. The sudden buzz of her phone shatters the quiet afternoon. One text from Dante, and the romantic illusion drops dead on the floor. Suddenly, he's barking orders, using her raw panic to guarantee absolute obedience. When his muscle rolls up to the curb, Ara barely hesitates before diving into the black sedan. Did you hear that heavy metallic thud of the doors locking? That's the sound of her fate sealing shut. As the car tears blindly through the city streets, She doesn't cry for her lost freedom. She just stares into the rearview mirror, calmly asking if his rival is coming to put them in the ground. Her moral compass has shrunk to just keeping him alive. Here is a heavy truth. Letting constant chaos into your world will eventually destroy your radar for right and wrong. Stick with me, because you and I are watching the absolute end of the line for her independence. Ara gets dragged into a windowless room, entirely cut off from the outside world. Dante lurks in the shadows, pulling her into a crushing embrace that knocks the wind out of her. He inspects her pale face like a prized possession, whispering that dodging bullets is just a normal Tuesday. He twists the terror, using danger to justify his violent lifestyle. Ara stands there, hands shaking so hard she can't even pretend to be brave. Then the heavy deadbolt slams shut and the lights cut out. A total nightmare. The lesson here is simple but brutal. Trading your personal freedom for a toxic promise of protection will always leave you completely defenseless in the dark. The camera lingers on the absolute wreckage of her spirit. Ara gasps for air, frantically whispering how terrified she is of losing him. It is a textbook psychological surrender. Her entire universe has shrunk down to this one dangerous man. Dante just stands there in the dim light, completely unable to admit he brought this on them. Look at the cold edge of his jaw. There is zero regret in his eyes, only a brutal vow to wipe out the rival who challenged him. His hollow voice sends a massive shiver down her spine, a chill she tragically mistakes for deep romantic devotion. It is pure madness. Listen to this crucial lesson, my friends. We often make the fatal mistake of confusing the fire that warms our hands with the fire that will eventually burn our entire house to the ground. Notice how the framing captures her total isolation. Dante leaves before dawn to get his bloody revenge, barking at Ara to stay hidden. He dictates her every breath while he turns the city into a war zone. Hour by agonizing hour, she paces the floor. Her panic isn't about escaping her cage. It is about the safe return of the monster who built it. When Dante finally stumbles through the door at 3 a.m, his shoulder is dislocated, his shirt soaked in blood. But his massive ego refuses to break. He rejects the hospital, demanding underground secrecy over his own health. By forcing Ara to play nurse, he physically binds her to his survival. Here is your harsh reality. We almost always end up bleeding the most for the exact people who happily hand us the blade. The scene captures the crushing weight of her compliance. Any normal person would sprint for the nearest exit, but Ara swallows her survival instinct, paralyzed by his heavy stare, as she bandages his deep stab wounds. Her eerie calmness proves her mind is fundamentally breaking. Dante clinically lists the people he slaughtered, talking about executing his rival and the witnesses with zero emotion. When she nervously asks if the gang wars will ever stop, his cold reply freezes the room. He whispers there is always another enemy. In his twisted head, this endless violence is the perfect excuse to control her forever. It brings us to a painful truth. Unchecked fear will always end up building the tallest, most inescapable prisons inside our own minds. Stay with me here, because you and I are about to step straight into the darkest part of this story. Dante openly brags about the brutality of his criminal empire, flat out telling her he will never change. Ara sees the massive red flags waving. She is literally wiping the sweat off a mafia boss. She knows she needs to run, but his psychological conditioning runs so deep, it chokes out her instinct to survive. Instead of leaving, she kisses the predator on the forehead and swears absolute loyalty. When an underground doctor arrives to stitch his torn shoulder, The cold routine makes this nightmare feel entirely normal. She gently tucks the crime lord into bed, accepting her dark role. Here is a massive lesson. Our most destructive choices almost always wear the disguised mask of true love. The focus tightens to show just how twisted her affection has become. Ara sits quietly beside the bed, her fingers lightly tracing the physical scars of his gang wars. She stares at the dark bruises and ugly stitches, actively spinning this horrific violence into a dark romantic fantasy. She has completely convinced herself that his toxic mafia cage is actually a secure fortress meant to protect her. It is the moment of her ultimate psychological defeat. When Dante wakes, he pulls a manipulative guilt trip, softly suggesting she should run away. It is a cruel, calculated test of her loyalty, and Ara fails it instantly, pressing her warm hand over his cold lips. The lesson is tragic. You completely lose your own identity the exact second you start falling in love with your own chains. In this agonizing close-up, Ara tortures her final bridge to sanity. She whispers that she understands exactly who he is, fully forgiving the undeniable fact that he is a monster. For a power-hungry mob boss, this is the ultimate prize. He gets to be worshipped for being a killer. Dante grabs her face, demanding he gets to own her forever, selling a life sentence as a grand romantic promise. They swap breathless confessions, confusing shared trauma for genuine intimacy. They stay locked in this bunker for 3 straight days, hiding from the sun. When they finally step outside, they look like shell-shocked soldiers returning from war. It leaves us with a chilling thought. The most dangerous lies in the world are the ones we choose to build together in the dark. You and I really need to talk about how this trauma bleeds into the real world. Ara projects her fractured mind straight onto the canvas. She paints a chaotic mix of violence and beauty, turning her hostage reality into high art. Her mentors praise the dark painting as a masterpiece, completely blind to the fact they are applauding a woman trapped by the mafia. When a friend asks what inspired it, Ara goes ice cold, vaguely blaming life. Then the energy shifts. Dante strolls in, flanked by armed muscle, gliding through her normal life like an apex predator on the prowl. It is a massive flex of power, hiding behind the mask of a supportive partner. Let this be a profound lesson. We constantly hang our deepest, painful wounds in plain sight for everyone around us to completely miss. Dante stands quietly before her masterpiece, comparing her beautiful art to his bloody mafia hits. By dragging her talent down to his violent level, he guarantees his validation is the only thing she craves. Soon, their lives fall into an insane loop of chaotic drama. They scream about his criminal empire, but he uses sudden flashes of charm to keep her locked in. His paranoid mob lifestyle becomes her everyday reality. Then, he brings her back to the exact restaurant where he first essentially kidnapped her. It is a massive psychological power move to launch his endgame. Under the dim lights, he slides a small velvet box across the table, and Ara just freezes. Here is a terrifying truth to remember. Total psychological captivity often wears a clever disguise and feels exactly like destiny. Watch this final moment with me, because this is the knockout blow to her sanity. Dante admits he is a monster she should run from, but then demands she submit to him forever. He spins his mob obsession into a tragic romance. Ara stares at the massive diamond, not seeing a handcuff, but a shiny medal for surviving his madness. She eagerly says yes. As he slips the heavy metal onto her finger, he softly claims he does not deserve her. It is a classic manipulator trick, forcing the victim to comfort the villain. When his mafia captains applaud her for being braver than a soldier, it entirely normalizes her mental doom. Keep this lesson close. Even the most stunning, expensive cages in the world are built for one reason: to permanently break your wings. Now, into this nightmare walks Jenna, stepping up as the ultimate reality check. She literally begs Ara to wake up, pointing out the blinding red flags of marrying a mafia boss. But watch how Ara completely loses the plot. She frantically tries to spin 6 chaotic months with a hitman as something better than a safe life. She clings to those rare, quiet moments where Dante actually acts human, tricking her own mind into believing she still has free will. Dante already has her in a deep psychological chokehold, disguising his absolute dominance as fierce protection. Defeated, Jenna finally throws her hands up and walks away into the night. It leaves us with a heavy truth. Sometimes our desperate need to feel loved completely blinds us to the very thing that is about to destroy us. Picture this isolated garden wedding, completely surrounded by goons holding rifles. Before the vows, Dante's sister pulls Ara aside. She is the last sane person in this bloodline. She reads her brother's darkness perfectly and offers Ara a running getaway car right there. She knows his obsessive affection is just pure terror wearing a tuxedo, but Ara does the unthinkable. She slams the escape door shut and willingly chooses the fire. We are watching a hostage fight to defend her own cage. The sister finally steps back, dropping a harsh threat on Dante before walking away. This is not romance. This is a villain locking down his favorite prize. It brings us to a simple reality. The darkest, most dangerous prisons in life are always locked from the inside. You and I really need to unpack these deeply disturbing wedding vows. Ara stands at the altar, talking about choosing love over fear, entirely ignoring the guns surrounding her. Meanwhile, Dante promises to be her ultimate protector, leaning hard into his twisted god complex. Later that night, he stares out over the city he rules, confessing a sudden fear. But do not be fooled. A ruthless mob boss does not fear losing a soulmate. He only fears losing control over his shiny toy. Those golden wedding bands are not symbols of sweet devotion. They are straight-up tracking collars. The lesson here cuts straight to the bone. A predator might whisper the word love, but to them, a ring is never a promise. It is just a heavy, expensive chain meant to keep you tethered in the dark. The visual atmosphere here is absolute late-night cinema. Notice how the heavy shadows practically swallow Ara whole while she sits, bracing for the next violent shootout. Her shoulders are tense, while Dante bathes in a warm light like an untouchable god. Out of nowhere, he buys her a private art studio. It looks like a massive romantic gesture, but it is ice-cold calculation. He feeds her crumbs of independence to ensure she never actually leaves. Then he sits at his grand piano, letting classical music drown out his empire, whispering lies about going completely legitimate. Do not buy his act. The truth is brutal. A cornered monster never actually seeks real redemption. They simply change their camouflage so they can keep hunting you right out in the open. Fast forward a few years, and the camera pushes right into Dante's face. The gray in his hair tells a story of deep paranoia. He knows a rival hitman will eventually clip his wings. So, he spins his cowardly exit strategy into a grand romantic gesture, asking Ara if she finally wants a normal life. Over the next 2 years, he liquidates his bloody empire and dumps the cash into high-end real estate. He acts like the violent killer is dead, but the reality is painfully obvious. He never changed his soul. He just traded bloody alleyways for ruthless corporate boardrooms. Ara falls for it completely, mistaking his tactical retreat for real emotional healing. The life lesson remains undeniable. A predator wrapped in a custom-tailored suit is still a creature born to hunt. Stick with me through this, because this art gallery scene is pure psychological horror. Ara opens a massive exhibit, putting all her trauma on public display. Dante has completely scrubbed his violent past, hiding his dirty mob money behind polished corporate logos. Watch his body language when the gallery finally clears out. He steps uncomfortably close, stealing her spotlight, and whispers that he personally destroyed every single person who stood in her way. And the most sickening part is that she looks up with shining eyes and genuinely thanks him. The agonizing life lesson here is impossible to miss. When you owe your biggest success to a deeply dangerous person, you have not found freedom at all. You have merely traded a rusty iron cage for a shining golden one. It is painful to watch them stand together among these vibrant paintings of destruction, quietly asking each other if they are truly happy. Both of them whisper yes without hesitation. They have completely romanticized the trauma, treating their toxic history of shootouts like some beautiful love story. Ara stares down at his hands, the exact same hands that ordered countless brutal hits, and smiles because they only play the piano now. She's drowning in delusion, genuinely believing her fragile savior complex actually cured a mafia boss. But the brutal truth hitting us right in the face cannot be ignored. You can never love the poison out of a venomous snake. A predator just learns to hunt in a softer, quieter place, so his beloved prize stays fast asleep in his arms. You and I have to look closely at this massive time jump. 5 years later, the camera finds them drifting through a sprawling mansion built entirely on blood and lies. Ara has fully surrendered to her role as the fragile girl saved by a reformed monster. Out on their sunlit porch, Dante leans in and asks if she regrets anything. He is subtly pulling her strings, checking to make sure he still owns her mind. She gazes out at the horizon, calling their survival pure cosmic luck, totally numb to the extreme psychological trauma that binds them. They truly believe their broken pieces fit perfectly. But the director drops a sobering lesson right here in the quiet air. Sometimes, the boring piece we desperately call a cure is really just the silent symptom of a completely fatal disease. And just like that, the screen fades to black, leaving us with the ultimate midnight tragedy. To think this nightmare started over a dropped glass in a restaurant, only to morph into this suffocating reality. Look at how desperately they grip each other against the glowing city skyline. They actually have the nerve to call this psychological sickness true love. They tricked themselves into believing two shattered people could magically fix each other just by sharing their darkest secrets. As the city hums far below them, Dante locks her into one final, inescapable embrace. It leaves us staring into the dark with one haunting truth. The human heart is so desperate for connection that it will gladly paint the cold iron bars of its own prison and call it a beautiful victory.